The courtroom was suffocatingly silent, the kind of silence that makes you hold your breath, waiting for something explosive to happen. It was the kind of silence that you could cut with a knife, the kind that spoke volumes of anticipation. The air hung heavy as everyone present seemed to brace themselves for the storm that was about to unfold. Judge Arnold, a man known for his sharp tongue and his zero tolerance for foolishness, sat at the bench with an intimidating air of authority. His cold gaze swept over the room, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he was in control. And then there was Andrew Carter, standing nervously before him. Andrew was young, barely out of law school, and the weight of the moment threatened to crush him. But there was something about the young man that made him different from the arrogant, hotshot lawyers Judge Arnold had so often dealt with. Andrew was calm, remarkably calm, almost unnervingly so. His demeanor was steady, unwavering even as the judge's glare bore down on him like a physical weight. The judge leaned forward, his voice like a thunderclap as he cut through the silence. "What makes you think you, of all people, have the authority to interpret this law?" Judge Arnold's words echoed off the high ceilings of the courtroom. "Have you even read this statute in full, or are you just trying to waste this court's time?" The spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some leaning forward, some fidgeting, as they awaited Andrew's response. He could feel their eyes on him, their judgment, their doubt. The air was thick with the pressure, but Andrew didn't flinch. He simply met the judge's gaze, his expression calm and composed. "Have you even read the statute in full?" Judge Arnold repeated, his voice rising, cutting through the tension. "Do you even know what it's meant to address? Or are you just parroting lines you memorized for the sake of a paycheck?" A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom, but Andrew's face remained stoic, his expression unreadable. His heart raced in his chest, but his hands, resting at his sides, remained steady. The laughter died almost as quickly as it had started. Slowly, Andrew adjusted his tie, never breaking his calm composure. His voice, when he spoke, was firm but gentle. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not just familiar with this law. I'm the one who wrote it." There was a collective gasp in the room. The laughter died instantly, and for a split second, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even Judge Arnold's steely expression faltered for just a moment. His jaw tightened, and his face paled, a brief flash of surprise flickering across his features before it was replaced by the usual stern, unreadable expression. The room seemed to tilt on its axis, and Andrew could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom turn to him. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, and for the first time, the judge's unflinching glare seemed to waver. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, everyone wondering what would come next. Andrew knew he was in uncharted territory. He had never expected his past, his work as a young intern drafting legislation with the guidance of his senator, to come back like this. He had spent years working in the shadows, far from the glare of the courtroom lights. His role in drafting the law was a quiet part of his journey, one he had never expected to be scrutinized in such a public way. The young lawyer swallowed, pushing aside his nervousness. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Linda Rodriguez, a woman fighting to protect her family bakery from a corporation that was using a twisted interpretation of the law to drive her out of business. And it was about the law itself, the law Andrew had helped create, a law designed to protect people like Linda from corporate greed. Judge Arnold, still reeling from the unexpected bombshell, leaned back in his chair. His piercing eyes never left Andrew's face. For a long moment, there was silence. No one dared to speak. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. Judge Arnold finally broke the silence, his voice laced with disbelief and a touch of mockery. "You?" the judge said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You wrote this law? Tell me, Mr. Carter, what makes you qualified to argue this case? Do you even understand what this law was meant to address? Or are you just reciting lines you memorized for the sake of a paycheck?" Andrew stood his ground. His face remained impassive, and his heart continued to race. His eyes locked with Judge Arnold's, and for the first time, Andrew could see a flicker of doubt in the judge's expression. "Your Honor," Andrew said, his voice unwavering, "I wrote this law. I was tasked with drafting the original proposal, and I worked closely with Senator Marshall to ensure it addressed the concerns of small business owners like my client, Linda Rodriguez. This law was designed to protect people like her from the exploitation of larger corporations, and I'm here today to defend that very purpose." There was a murmur of disbelief from the spectators. Judge Arnold's gaze remained fixed on Andrew, his expression unreadable. The corporate attorneys across the room exchanged skeptical glances. Michael Talbot, the lead attorney for the corporation, raised an eyebrow and smirked, clearly confident that Andrew would falter under the pressure. But Andrew wasn't about to back down. The words of his mother echoed in his mind, words that had always pushed him to persevere. "You've got something special in you, Andy. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." With those words fueling him, Andrew stood tall and continued. He laid out his argument, explaining the intent behind the law and how the corporation's interpretation was not only wrong, but violated the very principles the law was meant to protect. He spoke with the precision of someone who had lived and breathed the law, who had pored over every detail during his internship with Senator Marshall. The more he spoke, the more he could feel the weight of the courtroom shift. The spectators leaned forward, some nodding in agreement, others still skeptical. But Andrew didn't waver. He just hoped the judge would allow him to finish his argument before things got even more complicated. Judge Arnold's piercing glare never softened, but for the first time, it seemed to be tempered with something other than pure contempt. The room was silent as Andrew presented his case, every word carefully chosen, every point backed by evidence. But Andrew knew this battle wasn't over. Judge Arnold was a seasoned veteran of the courtroom, and he had seen more than his fair share of arrogant, overconfident young lawyers. Andrew was different. But that didn't mean he was safe. He was still in the middle of a battle, one that was just beginning. Andrew Carter had never imagined that he would be standing in a courtroom, especially not in front of a judge like Arnold. Born and raised in a small town in Missouri, Andrew had spent his childhood immersed in the simplicity of country life. His days consisted of playing baseball with his friends and helping his mother with chores. Life was far from easy. His father, a mechanic, passed away when Andrew was just 10, leaving his mother to raise him and his younger sister Katie on her own. But despite the hardships, Andrew had always known he was destined for something more. From an early age, Andrew demonstrated a thirst for knowledge that set him apart. His teachers noticed it quickly, his ability to ask insightful questions, the kind that made even adults pause and think. By high school, his fascination with law had grown. He spent hours reading about landmark cases and the fight for justice, igniting a passion that would shape his future. However, his dreams were constantly challenged by financial struggles. Money was always tight, and there were moments when Andrew questioned whether he should abandon his goals and help support his family. But his mother's words kept him going. "You've got something special in you, Andy. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words became his fuel, and he pursued his dreams with relentless determination. After high school, Andrew earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, where he majored in political science. He immersed himself in his studies, developing a strong foundation in law and government. But it was an internship with Senator Gregory Marshall that truly changed the course of his life. The senator was known for his commitment to reforming outdated laws that exploited small business owners. It was through this internship that Andrew's career began to take shape. Senator Marshall recognized Andrew's potential and tasked him with drafting new legislation aimed at protecting small businesses from corporate exploitation. The law was designed to close loopholes that allowed larger corporations to bully small business owners into unfair contracts. Andrew worked tirelessly, spending countless hours researching and consulting with experts. His efforts paid off when the law was passed unanimously in the state legislature, with his name quietly added to the legislative credits. He hadn't expected much recognition, but the law was a quiet victory, a piece of legislation that would, in Andrew's mind, make the world a fairer place for people like his mother. Years later, Andrew found himself in a completely different position than he had ever imagined. He was now a practicing lawyer, focused on helping small businesses navigate the complex legal landscape. He was content with his work, but little did he know that the law he helped create would come back to challenge him in the most unexpected way. Linda Rodriguez, a small business owner who owned a bakery that had been in her family for generations, was being sued by a large corporation. The corporation claimed she had violated a clause in her contract, one that Andrew knew was designed to protect people like her, not harm them. Linda was distraught, fearing that she would lose the bakery her grandparents had built from the ground up. Andrew promised to fight for her, but standing before Judge Arnold, the stakes had never been higher. He had spent countless hours preparing his arguments, but now, in the face of Judge Arnold's unrelenting skepticism and the corporate lawyer's pressure, he began to feel the weight of the responsibility. Despite the pressure, Andrew remained composed. He knew what he had to do. He had to stand his ground and make the case that the law was being twisted. The law was meant to protect small business owners like Linda from corporate giants, but it was being manipulated to force her out of business. He couldn't let that happen. Not after everything he had worked for, not after everything his mother had sacrificed to get him to this point. As Judge Arnold continued to question his authority, Andrew thought back to his time in the senator's office, working late into the night on that legislation, researching the law's every detail, consulting with experts to make sure it would protect people like Linda. The judge's skepticism didn't shake him. It reminded him of why he had gotten into law in the first place, to ensure fairness, to prevent people from being exploited. He wasn't about to let that go. The courtroom's tension was palpable. Andrew could feel the weight of every eye on him. The corporate attorneys, led by Michael Talbot, were watching him closely, waiting for him to falter. But Andrew didn't flinch. He kept his cool and slowly began explaining the purpose of the law, focusing on the clause that the corporation had twisted. This wasn't just about Linda's bakery. It was about the entire purpose of the law, about protecting small businesses from corporate manipulation. Andrew's explanation was detailed and methodical. He pointed out the flaws in the corporation's interpretation of the law and how it directly contradicted the law's intent. He spoke with conviction, his voice steady and firm. But Judge Arnold wasn't ready to accept Andrew's argument. The judge's cold gaze never wavered, and his words were sharp, challenging Andrew at every turn. Despite the pushback, Andrew didn't back down. He knew that this case wasn't just about him. It was about ensuring the law did what it was meant to do, and he was willing to fight for that. As the courtroom remained tense, Andrew carefully laid out his evidence. The law had been designed to prevent large corporations from taking advantage of small business owners, but the corporation was exploiting it for their own gain. But even as Andrew spoke, he could feel the pressure mounting. The corporate attorneys smirked, certain that he would buckle under the weight of their argument. And Judge Arnold, despite his earlier shock, continued to press him, asking difficult questions, looking for any sign of weakness. Andrew's resolve remained unshaken, but he knew this battle was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with a palpable energy as the corporate attorneys continued their assault on Andrew's arguments. Michael Talbot, the lead attorney for the corporation, sat across from him with a smug, self-assured look on his face. Talbot had the demeanor of someone who was used to winning, used to intimidating young lawyers who thought they could take on corporate giants. But Andrew wasn't one of those lawyers. He wasn't intimidated. He had come here to do what was right, and he wasn't about to let anyone bully him into giving up. Andrew stood tall at the plaintiff's table, keeping his composure despite the mounting pressure. He knew that the next few minutes would determine the course of the case, and, potentially, his career. His arguments had been solid, but Talbot wasn't about to let him get away with it so easily. Talbot leaned forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Your Honor," Talbot began, his tone dripping with condescension. "It seems Mr. Carter is fond of spinning a tale, doesn't he? Claiming to have written the very law he's now defending, all while presenting evidence that appears to be, how shall we say it, conveniently fabricated." A ripple of laughter spread through the courtroom, and Andrew could feel his chest tighten. The last thing he needed was to lose his cool in front of the judge and everyone else. But he wasn't going to let Talbot get away with these false accusations. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to counter Talbot's claim. "Your Honor," Andrew said, his voice calm and firm, "I assure you, the documents I've presented are authentic. They can be verified. And if Mr. Talbot believes they're fabricated, I invite him to provide evidence to the contrary." Talbot's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. He was a seasoned lawyer, and he knew how to play the game. "I'm afraid we don't take Mr. Carter's word for it, Your Honor," Talbot replied, his voice smooth. "We have our own evidence that casts serious doubt on the credibility of his claims. I move that this case be dismissed, based on Mr. Carter's misconduct in presenting false evidence." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The accusation hung in the air, heavy with the potential to derail everything Andrew had worked for. His heart raced in his chest, but he refused to let the doubt creep in. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. Judge Arnold, who had been quiet up until this point, sat up straighter in his chair, his sharp eyes narrowing as he regarded Andrew. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice low and deliberate, "I expect the highest level of professionalism in this courtroom. If you are found to have misrepresented evidence, you will face serious consequences." Andrew nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew this wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about his reputation, his career, and the integrity of the law he had worked so hard to shape. He had to prove that the evidence was real, and that the corporation's claims were baseless. "I understand, Your Honor," Andrew said, his voice steady. "And I assure you, I have nothing to hide. The documents I've presented are legitimate, and I am prepared to prove that." The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Arnold regarded him for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally, the judge turned his attention back to Talbot. "Mr. Talbot," he said, his voice cold, "do you have any concrete evidence to support your claims that Mr. Carter has fabricated these documents?" Talbot hesitated for a moment before responding, his earlier confidence wavering. "We have reason to believe the documents are not what they seem, Your Honor," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "But we don't have concrete proof at this moment." Judge Arnold's lips tightened. "Then, I suggest you refrain from making accusations without evidence, he said sharply. I expect the truth to be presented in this court, not baseless allegations. Andrew couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The judge had just put Talbot in his place, but Andrew knew this was far from over. He still had to prove that the corporation was using the law against Linda for their own gain. He couldn't let this distraction derail his case. With a deep breath, Andrew turned back to the judge. Your Honor, he said, if I may continue, I would like to explain the intent behind the law in question and how the corporation's interpretation is in direct violation of that intent. Judge Arnold nodded, gesturing for Andrew to proceed. Go ahead, Mr. Carter, but make it quick. I won't tolerate any further theatrics in this courtroom. Andrew nodded and stepped forward, prepared to make his case. He wasn't going to let Talbot or anyone else undermine the truth. He carefully laid out the purpose of the law, how it was designed to protect small businesses from the exploitative practices of larger corporations. He pointed to the clause that was being misinterpreted, explaining how it was meant to prevent corporate giants from manipulating contracts to their advantage. As he spoke, Andrew could feel the weight of the room shift. The spectators, who had been skeptical of him at the start, were now listening intently. Even Judge Arnold seemed to soften slightly, though his gaze remained fixed and calculating. Andrew continued, walking the court through the specifics of the law and how it applied to Linda's case. He cited examples of how the law had been used in the past to protect small business owners, providing a clear and undeniable argument that the corporation's actions were not only legally dubious, but morally reprehensible as well. Despite Andrew's strong arguments, Talbot wasn't ready to back down. The corporate attorney fired back with sharp questions, attempting to poke holes in Andrew's case. He tried to twist Andrew's words and portray him as a naive lawyer, grasping at straws. But Andrew held his ground, each word carefully chosen, each argument delivered with confidence and precision. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Judge Arnold spoke again. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice measured but still stern, I have heard your argument, and while I am not yet convinced, I will allow this case to continue. But be warned, this court will not tolerate any further delays or distractions. Andrew felt a surge of relief, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The judge's approval didn't mean the case was won. It simply meant he had been given the opportunity to fight, and he would fight with everything he had. As the court recessed for lunch, Andrew stepped outside into the crisp autumn air. The tension inside the courtroom had been suffocating, but out here, the world felt a little bit more manageable. Linda caught up with him, her face etched with worry. Do you think we're going to lose? She asked, her voice trembling. Andrew turned to her, offering a reassuring smile. Not if I can help it, he said firmly. He wasn't about to let Linda lose everything she had worked for. And he wasn't about to let a corrupt corporation get away with exploiting small businesses. Not on his watch. Andrew walked briskly, his mind racing as he headed for a quiet corner of the courthouse to gather his thoughts before the afternoon session. The weight of the case pressed heavily on him, and the tension from the morning's battle was far from gone. But just as he tried to steady his thoughts, his phone buzzed in his pocket, startling him. He pulled it out, frowning as he saw the unknown number flashing on the screen. He hesitated for a moment, the chill of unease creeping up his spine. There had been no shortage of strange calls lately, threats, warnings, and the ever-present feeling that someone was watching his every move. He almost didn't want to answer, but something told him this call was different. Reluctantly, he pressed the green button and brought the phone to his ear. Hello? The voice on the other end was familiar, but it still sent a wave of dread crashing through him. Andrew, it's Senator Marshall. We need to talk. Andrew's pulse quickened. He had been expecting an update, but the urgency in the senator's tone was unmistakable. "Senator, what's going on? I'm in the middle of a trial and—" "I know," the senator cut him off, his voice tight with concern. "I just heard about what's happening in your case, and I need to warn you. There's more at play here than you realize. I've been getting word that they're pulling strings behind the scenes, and they're already planning their next move. They won't stop until they've taken you down, Andrew." A cold knot formed in Andrew's stomach. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who's behind this?" "I don't know the full scope yet, but the corporation has powerful allies. They've been using their influence to twist the law and manipulate the system. They know that if you win this case, it could set off a chain reaction that they won't be able to control." Andrew's thoughts raced. This was bigger than he had imagined. He had known the stakes were high, but now it seemed as if the entire system was stacked against him. He wasn't just fighting for Linda's bakery anymore. He was fighting a corporate empire with connections that ran deep. "Andrew, listen carefully," Senator Marshall continued, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to be careful. They've got people on the inside, and they're using every tactic they can to discredit you. If they can't break you in the courtroom, they'll try something else. They'll go after your reputation, your career, your life. This isn't just about one case. It's about keeping the status quo intact." A cold shiver ran down Andrew's spine. "What do I do?" he asked, trying to keep the fear from his voice. "Stay focused on the case," the senator replied, "but be on guard. Don't trust anyone outside of your immediate circle. And whatever happens, do not back down. If you expose the truth, there's no going back. They'll come after you with everything they've got." Andrew's grip tightened around his phone, his mind spinning with the senator's words. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war. A war that Andrew had never imagined he'd be thrust into. But now that he was in the thick of it, he had no choice but to keep fighting. He couldn't afford to back down, not when so many people's lives were at stake. "Thank you for the warning, Senator," Andrew said, his voice steady despite the churn of emotions inside him. "I'll be careful." The senator's voice softened slightly. "I'll be monitoring the situation closely. If you need anything, don't hesitate to reach out. But remember, Andrew, you're not alone in this. We'll bring the truth to light." With that, the senator hung up, leaving Andrew standing in the courthouse hallway, his mind reeling. He had known the stakes were high, but now it seemed as if the very system he had been working to protect was actively working against him. The fight had just become a lot more dangerous. As the afternoon session began, Andrew felt the weight of the world bearing down on him. He sat at the plaintiff's table, his eyes scanning the room, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't shake the senator's warning, couldn't escape the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. The opposing counsel, led by Talbot, had already proven they were willing to do whatever it took to win, and now Andrew had to be ready for whatever they threw his way. The trial continued with the same intense back and forth, Andrew presenting his case with meticulous care, while Talbot tried to twist every word, attempting to undermine Andrew's credibility. But Andrew was prepared. He had the law on his side, and he knew it. He wasn't going to let a corporate lawyer bully him into submission. But as the day wore on, Andrew couldn't help but feel the eyes of the room constantly on him. The spectators, the corporate lawyers, even Judge Arnold. They were all watching, waiting for him to make a mistake. He couldn't afford to slip up. Not now. The courtroom recessed for a brief break, and Andrew stepped outside to catch his breath. The cool autumn air hit his face, and for a moment he allowed himself to relax, to clear his mind. But just as quickly as the calm came, a sense of dread settled over him. The senator's warning echoed in his head. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, that someone was always one step behind. Suddenly, his phone buzzed again, this time with an unknown number. Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end before the voice spoke. It was a man, his voice low and gruff. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I suggest you stop now. Walk away from this case before it's too late." Andrew's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't think you need to know that," the voice replied, dripping with menace. "But you should know. You're in over your head. If you keep going, you'll regret it. We can make all of this disappear, but only if you back down. Don't say we didn't warn you." The line went dead before Andrew could respond. He stood frozen, the phone still pressed to his ear. But there was nothing but silence. The warning had been clear. Someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to stop him. As Andrew stood there, the reality of the situation hit him harder than ever before. This wasn't just a courtroom battle. This was a battle for everything he believed in: the law, justice, and the truth. But it was also a battle for his own survival. With a deep breath, he put the phone down, his mind racing. He couldn't back down. He wouldn't. Not after everything he had worked for. But the stakes had just gotten much higher, and Andrew knew that the fight was far from over. The next morning, as Andrew entered the courthouse, he couldn't shake the weight of the previous day's events. The mysterious call from Senator Marshall still echoed in his mind. Whoever was behind this, whether it was the corporation or someone pulling their strings, wasn't going to stop. But Andrew couldn't back down. He had a responsibility to Linda, to the truth, and to the integrity of the law he had helped create. The courtroom was already packed when Andrew walked in. Reporters, spectators, and the opposing counsel were all present, their eyes focused on him as he made his way to the plaintiff's table. Michael Talbot, the lead attorney for the corporation, sat confidently at the defense table, a smug expression on his face as he scanned Andrew. It was clear Talbot believed this battle was already won, but Andrew wasn't going to make it that easy. Linda sat beside him, her face a mixture of anxiety and hope. She had been through so much, and now it was up to Andrew to make sure her family's bakery survived. As he sat down, he gave her a reassuring smile, though inside, his stomach was churning. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be pretty. Judge Arnold entered the room with his usual stern expression, slamming his gavel down to call the court to order. The sound echoed through the room, and the tension in the air seemed to heighten. Andrew stood as the judge addressed him. "Mr. Carter, I trust you've come prepared to substantiate your claims?" Judge Arnold's voice was sharp, his piercing gaze locked on Andrew. Andrew stood tall, trying to mask the weight of the growing pressure. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves. He had done everything he could to prepare, and he wasn't going to let a room full of skeptics, or a corrupt corporation, derail the truth. He reached into his briefcase and began to pull out the evidence he had meticulously prepared. He had the original drafts of the law, along with the annotations and emails he had exchanged with Senator Marshall's office during the drafting process. This was the proof he needed to show that the law had been created with the intention of protecting small businesses like Linda's Bakery. As Andrew laid the documents on the table, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. The corporate attorneys exchanged glances, their faces hardening as they reviewed the materials. Talbot leaned forward, clearly eager to find a way to discredit Andrew. He wasn't going to let this opportunity slip by. "Your Honor," Talbot said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "we object to the introduction of these documents as evidence. There's no way to verify their authenticity. For all we know, Mr. Carter has fabricated these records to suit his narrative." Andrew's blood ran cold at the accusation, but he remained calm. This was exactly what he had expected. Another attempt to discredit him, to undermine the evidence he was presenting. He had prepared for this, and he wasn't going to let Talbot's game-playing distract him. "Your Honor, these documents are part of the official records," Andrew said firmly. "They can be verified through the Senator's office and the state legislature's archives. I'm prepared to provide the necessary verification, if needed." Judge Arnold raised an eyebrow at the defense. "Mr. Talbot," he said sharply, "do you have any concrete evidence to suggest these documents are fabricated?" Talbot hesitated for a moment before responding, his voice faltering slightly. "We don't have concrete proof at this moment, Your Honor, but we believe there are discrepancies that warrant further investigation." Andrew didn't let the judge's gaze waver from him. "I stand by the authenticity of these documents, Your Honor," he said, "and if Mr. Talbot doubts their validity, I'm happy to provide additional proof. But I assure you, these records are legitimate." Judge Arnold leaned back in his chair, considering the arguments. "Very well," he said finally, his voice cold. "The court will allow these documents as evidence for now, but I expect no more theatrics, Mr. Carter. If they are proven to be false, you will face consequences." Andrew nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He had to keep his composure. This was just the beginning. The hardest part was still ahead. The trial continued, with Andrew presenting his evidence in painstaking detail. He outlined the purpose of the law and how the corporation had twisted its meaning to suit their own ends. He explained the clause in question and how it had been misinterpreted, showing how it was meant to protect small businesses from exploitation. He laid out case after case where the law had been used to prevent corporate bullying, driving home the point that Linda's Bakery deserved protection, not persecution. But the tension in the room continued to mount. Talbot and his team were relentless, attempting to poke holes in Andrew's arguments at every turn. They questioned his motives, tried to discredit his role in drafting the law, and accused him of overreaching in his interpretation. Every word Andrew spoke was met with a challenge, every piece of evidence scrutinized with suspicion. As the day wore on, Andrew began to feel the weight of the courtroom closing in on him. The pressure was mounting. He could feel it in the way the spectators were watching him, in the way Talbot's team tried to shake his confidence with every word they spoke. But he couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. Not when Linda's Bakery, and his own career, hung in the balance. Then, just as Andrew was wrapping up his argument, something happened that made his heart stop. One of the corporate lawyers, a man named Douglas Graham, who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, stood up abruptly and walked toward the judge. "Your Honor," Graham said, his voice booming with authority, "I apologize for the interruption, but I have critical information that I believe should be presented immediately." Andrew's stomach twisted in knots. He recognized Graham, the CEO of the corporation suing Linda, and he could feel the ominous weight of what was about to happen. If Graham was stepping forward now, it was because he had something to derail Andrew's case, something that could change everything. Judge Arnold looked at Graham, his expression hardening. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Graham," the judge said sternly. "If you wish to submit evidence, it must go through the proper channels." With an exaggerated air of politeness, Graham handed a folder to the judge. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I believe this cannot wait. Mr. Carter's so-called evidence isn't as legitimate as he claims." Andrew felt his chest tighten as he watched Graham hand the folder over. He knew that this was a calculated move. It wasn't just about presenting new evidence. It was an attempt to discredit everything Andrew had worked for, to crush his credibility once and for all. The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Judge Arnold flipped through the documents Graham had submitted. The room was silent, save for the faint rustle of paper, and Andrew could feel every eye in the room on him. Linda, sitting beside him, clutched her hands nervously, her face pale with fear. Andrew's heart raced, but he refused to show it. He knew this wasn't just about proving his case anymore. It was about keeping everything he had worked for intact. If Graham had presented something damning, it could ruin everything. Judge Arnold glanced at the documents, then back at Andrew, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, his voice heavy with suspicion, "it seems the defense has presented something new. Mr. Graham, you claim these documents have bearing on this case. Is that correct?" Graham stood tall, his voice smooth as he addressed the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "We believe that Mr. Carter has been less than forthcoming with the court. These documents, emails, records, and correspondence, demonstrate that he is not as involved with the drafting of this law as he claims. In fact, they prove that his role has been exaggerated, and that the law itself may not have the protections Mr. Carter is asserting." Andrew's stomach dropped. He could feel the weight of the accusation. The room seemed to close in around him, and all he could hear was the beating of his own heart. The very documents he had relied on to build his case were now being questioned in front of everyone. He stood tall, despite the feeling of unease washing over him. He couldn't let this derail everything he had fought for. "I object to these documents being presented," Andrew said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "I've worked closely with the senator and the legislative committee to ensure the accuracy of the law. These documents cannot possibly contain the information Mr. Graham claims they do." Judge Arnold's piercing gaze shifted between Graham and Andrew. The judge was known for his no-nonsense approach, and it was clear he wasn't going to let either side get away with anything. "I'll review the documents," Judge Arnold said curtly. "But be warned, any attempt to mislead this court will result in serious consequences." Graham's expression remained smug as the judge flipped through the pages. Andrew couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in his chest. What if this was it? What if Graham had somehow managed to find a way to discredit him entirely? A few moments passed, and Judge Arnold's face remained unreadable. Finally, the judge looked up. "Mr. Carter," he said slowly, "these documents do raise serious questions. They claim to show email exchanges between you and the senator's office that contradict your statements. You'll need to address these discrepancies immediately." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. He felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what had happened. The documents Graham had presented weren't just ordinary records. They were forged. Someone had gone to great lengths to create these false emails, trying to paint him as dishonest, trying to ruin his credibility. Andrew's mind raced, but he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. He had to prove that these documents were fake, that they were part of a deliberate attempt to destroy him. With his jaw clenched, he stepped forward, addressing the judge and the court. "Your Honor," Andrew began, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "I'm aware of what has been presented before you, but I can assure you these documents are forged. I did not write these emails, nor did I have any correspondence with the senator's office that matches the contents of these so-called records." The courtroom was silent as Andrew's words hung in the air. Talbot and Graham exchanged smug glances, clearly confident that this would be the moment Andrew's case fell apart. But Andrew wasn't finished yet. "I have access to the original emails, Your Honor," Andrew continued, his voice gaining strength. "I have the metadata and the timestamps that prove these documents are fake. They were altered, fabricated, and presented here to discredit me." Judge Arnold raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by Andrew's bold statement. "Do you have the original copies of these emails?" he asked, his voice sharp. "If what you say is true, you'll have concrete evidence to back it up." Andrew nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this was his chance to turn the tide. "Yes, Your Honor. I have all the original emails and files, and I can provide them immediately. If the court will allow me, I'll submit the metadata and the server records to prove that the documents Mr. Graham presented were falsified." The judge considered Andrew's words for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. The court will accept your offer to submit the original emails and metadata as evidence. But be warned, Mr. Carter, if these records are found to be authentic, there will be consequences for anyone attempting to manipulate the court's proceedings." Andrew breathed a sigh of relief. This wasn't over, but it was a victory nonetheless. He turned to Linda, offering a reassuring smile. She returned the gesture, but her eyes were wide with concern. She knew as well as Andrew that they were far from safe. This fight had just escalated in ways they couldn't predict. The judge called for a brief recess while the court reviewed the documents. Andrew stepped outside into the hallway, feeling a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had to act quickly to secure the proof he needed. He reached for his phone and dialed his trusted tech expert, a friend from law school who had helped him with similar cases before. "Jack," Andrew said when the call was answered, "I need you to do something urgent. I need you to pull the metadata from the original emails. We're facing a forged document attack, and I need to prove that the emails Graham submitted are fake." Jack's voice came through the phone, crackling slightly with static. "Got it, Andrew. I'll get to work right away. Just send me everything you have." Andrew quickly forwarded the emails, along with the server information. Jack was quick and efficient, and Andrew knew that with his help, they would be able to prove the documents were falsified. But as Andrew paced the hallway, his phone buzzed again. An unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he answered the call. "Hello?" "Mr. Carter." The voice on the other end was gruff and cold. "I know what you're up to, and I suggest you drop this case before it's too late. You're not the only one with resources, and we can make things very difficult for you." Andrew's stomach turned. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. His grip tightened around his phone. This was no longer just about a case. It was about survival. Whoever was behind these threats was willing to stop at nothing to silence him. Andrew had no choice but to keep moving forward, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As the courtroom reconvened, Andrew's anxiety was replaced by a steely determination. Jack had sent over the metadata, confirming that the emails Graham presented were indeed forged. Andrew walked into the courtroom with renewed resolve. He was ready to show everyone, including the judge, the truth. When the court resumed, Andrew presented the evidence, linking the forged emails to a private server that had no connection to the senator's office. The data was clear, and Andrew knew that this would expose the corporation's tactics once and for all. The room fell silent as Judge Arnold examined the evidence. "This is undeniable," Judge Arnold said, his voice thick with disbelief. "Mr. Graham, you have some explaining to do." Graham's smug expression faltered, and Andrew could feel the victory slipping away from him. But he wasn't about to stop here. The truth had come to light, and now the court had no choice but to recognize it. The courtroom was eerily quiet as Judge Arnold scrutinized the metadata that Andrew had presented. His gaze shifted between the documents, the screen, and the defense team. The atmosphere was charged with tension. Even the spectators, who had been murmuring with skepticism earlier, were now on the edge of their seats, waiting for the next move. The forged documents, presented by the corporation's legal team, had been exposed for what they were: an attempt to deceive the court and discredit Andrew. Andrew stood at the plaintiff's table, his heart still pounding, but now with a sense of triumph. The evidence was irrefutable. The emails presented by Graham had been sent from a private server, one that had no connection to the senator's office. It was the smoking gun that Andrew had been searching for. He had anticipated this moment, and now that it had arrived, he wasn't about to let it slip away. Judge Arnold's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the documents one final time. "Mr. Graham," the judge said, his voice cold and steady, "do you have an explanation for these discrepancies?" Graham, clearly rattled, hesitated for a moment before he responded. "Your Honor, we were provided these documents by an anonymous source," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "We had no reason to believe they were forged. We trusted the authenticity of the information." Andrew felt a surge of disgust rise in his chest. Graham's words were empty, an attempt to deflect the responsibility. But it was clear that the judge wasn't buying it. "I find it highly convenient," Judge Arnold said, his tone biting, "that an anonymous source has provided you with such critical documents. I will not tolerate deceit in this courtroom. Mr. Graham, I am considering this an attempt to mislead the court. There will be consequences for this behavior." The corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Andrew couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The judge had just delivered a blow to their credibility. But even as Andrew basked in the small victory, he knew that this wasn't over. This was just the first step. The judge turned his attention to Andrew. "Mr. Carter," Judge Arnold said, "I must commend you on uncovering this forgery. Your diligence has brought to light a serious attempt to undermine the integrity of this court. However, we must proceed carefully. The case is not yet concluded." Andrew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He wasn't about to celebrate just yet. The corporation wasn't going to give up so easily. He could feel the eyes of the corporate attorneys boring into him, and he knew that they were already plotting their next move. "We will continue the proceedings tomorrow," Judge Arnold announced, bringing the gavel down with finality. "Mr. Carter, I expect you to submit the remaining evidence for the court's review. This trial is far from over." As the courtroom began to empty, Andrew felt a mix of exhaustion and relief. He had won a significant battle, but the war was far from over. Linda, who had been sitting quietly beside him, finally spoke up, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you, Andrew," she said softly, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know what I would have done without you. I really thought I was going to lose the bakery." Andrew smiled faintly, but there was a heaviness in his heart. "We're not done yet," he said. "We still have a long way to go. But I promise you, I won't let them take your family's legacy from you." Linda nodded, her trust in him unwavering. But Andrew could see the doubt in her eyes. This case had already taken a toll on both of them, and it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Andrew walked out of the courthouse, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. He unlocked the phone, frowning as he read the message. It was from an unknown number, and the contents sent a chill through his bones. "You think you've won, but this is far from over. We have eyes on you, Carter. Don't think you're safe. You're walking a dangerous path, and if you don't stop now, there will be consequences. Consider this a warning." The words were clear and menacing. Andrew's grip tightened around his phone as the weight of the threat sank in. Whoever was behind this was determined to stop him, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to do so. He looked up at the sky, the crisp autumn air biting at his face. He had been warned before, but this felt different. This was no longer just a legal battle. It was a fight for his life. The corporate empire he was up against had resources, power, and influence far beyond what Andrew had imagined. And now, it seemed, they were pulling out all the stops to make sure he didn't win. Andrew couldn't let this intimidate him, though. He had come too far, and he had too much at stake. He couldn't back down. Not when Linda's future, and the future of countless small business owners, depended on him. With a deep breath, Andrew shoved the phone back into his pocket and made his way to his car. He had one goal now: to gather the remaining evidence and prepare for the next day. He had won a critical victory, but the battle was far from over. As he drove home, his mind raced. The threats, the forged documents, the constant pressure. It was all building up, and Andrew wasn't sure how much longer he could keep going at this pace. But there was no turning back now. He had come too far to quit. When he arrived at his apartment, he immediately went to his desk and began reviewing the evidence he had collected. He pulled up the emails, the metadata, and the annotations he had made when he first worked on the law. He knew that he couldn't afford to miss anything. One small mistake, one overlooked detail, and it could all come crashing down. As the night wore on, Andrew worked tirelessly, cross-referencing every piece of evidence, making sure that everything was in order. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he compiled his argument, determined to ensure that every point was solid. He wasn't going to let them win, not after everything he had sacrificed. But just as he was about to call it a night, a knock on the door interrupted his concentration. Andrew froze, his heart pounding. Who could it be at this hour? He hadn't expected anyone. Cautiously, he walked to the door and peered through the peephole. His heart skipped a beat when he saw who was standing outside. Elaine Turner, his former law professor and mentor. Andrew opened the door, his surprise evident. "Elaine," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What are you doing here?" Elaine stepped inside, her face serious. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "This isn't just about the bakery anymore. There's a lot more at stake here than you realize." Andrew closed the door behind her, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Elaine looked at him gravely. "I've been following your case, and I've learned something that could change everything." Elaine sat across from Andrew, her face serious as she revealed what she had uncovered. Her presence, usually a source of reassurance, now felt like a heavy weight on Andrew's shoulders. He had known that the case he was fighting was important, but he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption went. "Andrew," Elaine began, her voice low and filled with concern, "I've been digging into the corporation's background, and what I've found is bigger than we imagined. They have powerful allies, corporate magnates, politicians, and even law enforcement. They've been manipulating the system for years, and now they're using everything in their power to stop you from exposing them." Andrew leaned forward, his mind racing as he absorbed Elaine's words. "So, it's not just about the bakery? They're trying to stop the law, the one I helped write?" Elaine nodded gravely. "Yes, it's about protecting the status quo. They've been using the law to exploit small businesses, and your victory could change that. They can't afford to let you win. If you expose this corruption, it could unravel everything they've built." Andrew felt a chill run through him. This was no longer just about Linda's bakery. It was about dismantling an entire system of exploitation. But how far does this go? Who can we trust if even the system is rigged? Elaine's gaze hardened. It goes all the way to the top, Andrew. But we don't need to fight them alone. We can gather evidence, bring in trusted journalists and investigators, and expose what they're doing. But we have to be careful. There are eyes everywhere. Andrew felt the weight of the task before him, but his resolve only grew stronger. He couldn't let this system continue to hurt people like Linda. "How do we start?" he asked, determined to take action. Elaine's face softened slightly. "We start by gathering more evidence. Financial records, internal memos, anything that ties the corporation to their corrupt practices. We'll need to be cautious, but we can take them down if we work together." Andrew nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm not backing down. We'll expose the truth." Elaine gave him a reassuring smile, but her eyes remained filled with caution. "Be careful, Andrew. They'll stop at nothing to silence you. You've already made yourself a target." As she left, Andrew felt a mixture of gratitude and fear. He now knew the full scope of the battle he was facing. It was no longer just a legal case. It was a fight against a powerful, corrupt system. But he wasn't backing down. Later that night, as Andrew worked on his case, the weight of the threats hung over him. His phone buzzed again, and his heart skipped a beat when he saw an unknown number on the screen. Reluctantly, he answered. "Mr. Carter." The voice on the other end was cold. "You're getting too close. We suggest you back off before things get worse." Andrew's grip tightened on the phone, but the line went dead before he could respond. His mind raced. He wasn't backing down, but he had to be prepared for whatever came next. The next morning, as Andrew entered the courthouse, he couldn't shake the unease from the mysterious phone call the night before. The threats were becoming more direct, and it seemed like the stakes were rising higher with each passing day. His thoughts lingered on the warning from the unknown caller. "You're getting too close." He had to ignore it, though. He couldn't afford to be distracted. He had a responsibility to Linda, to the truth, and to the law itself. The case had escalated in ways he hadn't anticipated, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had to press forward and win this battle, not just for Linda's bakery, but for everyone who depended on the fairness of the legal system. As he entered the courtroom, Andrew noticed the tension in the air. The corporate legal team, led by Michael Talbot, was already seated at their table, their posture rigid, their faces set in stone. Talbot, ever the professional, gave Andrew a pointed look, clearly unfazed by the mounting evidence against his team. He'd seen this type of situation before, no doubt. Corporate lawyers like Talbot were used to manipulating the system to their advantage. But this time, Andrew was prepared. His legal team, though small, had worked tirelessly to gather the evidence needed to expose the corruption that ran deep in the corporation's tactics. Every email, every piece of financial data, every document they'd uncovered pointed to one undeniable truth. The corporation had been exploiting small businesses for years, using the law to its advantage. Judge Arnold entered the room, his customary stern look in place as he called the court to order. The moment he sat down, the courtroom fell silent, the weight of the case pressing on everyone in the room. Andrew could feel the pressure mounting, but he held his composure, keeping his focus on the task at hand. "Mr. Carter," Judge Arnold said, looking over his glasses at Andrew, "you've presented a compelling argument up until this point, but the defense claims that you've misrepresented evidence, and they have submitted new documents to the court. You will now have the opportunity to address these documents." Andrew took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had already seen the documents in question, and he knew they were fabricated. The corporate legal team had gone to great lengths to undermine his credibility, by introducing forged emails, hoping to discredit the evidence he had presented. But Andrew was ready. He stood up and walked to the front of the courtroom, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Your Honor, I have reviewed the documents submitted by the defense, and I can tell you without a doubt that they are false. The emails presented are not authentic, and I am prepared to prove it." Talbot sneered from across the room, but Andrew didn't let his confidence waver. "These emails," Andrew continued, "have been forged. They were altered to look like correspondence between me and the senator's office, but I have the original emails and the metadata to show that they were fabricated." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, and Andrew could feel the eyes of the spectators and the judge on him. He knew that this was a make-or-break moment. If he could prove the forgeries, it would be a significant victory. But if the judge didn't believe him, it could mean the end of the case. "I've submitted the original metadata and emails to the court," Andrew said, turning to the judge. "These documents are verifiable through the senator's office. I can provide the server logs and timestamps to show that the emails presented by the defense were not sent by me." Judge Arnold nodded, clearly taking Andrew's words seriously. "Very well, Mr. Carter. I will review the evidence, but be warned. If this turns out to be a ploy to mislead the court, there will be consequences." Andrew felt his pulse quicken as the judge reviewed the evidence. He stood tall, trying to remain composed, though his mind was racing. This could be the moment that either secured his victory or shattered his credibility forever. His thoughts drifted briefly to Linda, who was sitting behind him, clutching her hands tightly together. He knew that, no matter the outcome, this case had already taken a toll on her. He couldn't afford to let her down. As the judge continued to review the documents, Andrew's thoughts wandered back to the growing threats and the phone calls that had haunted him over the past few days. They were clearly escalating, and the corporation wasn't going to give up without a fight. But he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had come too far to back down now. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Judge Arnold looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, "I've reviewed the documents you've submitted, and I must say, the evidence you've provided is compelling. It does seem that the emails presented by the defense were altered. The metadata is inconsistent with the senator's records." Andrew's heart skipped a beat as the judge's words sank in. This was it, the breakthrough he had been waiting for. The defense's forged documents had been exposed for what they were, but Andrew couldn't afford to relax. The corporate lawyers wouldn't give up that easily, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. Judge Arnold's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Talbot, your objections have been noted, but this court will not tolerate attempts to manipulate evidence. If you have no further evidence to counter Mr. Carter's claims, we will proceed with the case." Talbot's expression shifted from smug confidence to frustration. He looked at his legal team, then back at the judge, clearly struggling to come up with a response. But the damage had been done. The corporation's attempt to undermine Andrew's case had failed. Andrew took a moment to collect himself before turning back to the judge. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm. "I would now like to continue presenting the rest of the evidence in support of my client's case." As Andrew continued to lay out his case, the courtroom seemed to shift. The tension that had once hung in the air like a storm cloud began to dissipate. The spectators, who had been skeptical of Andrew at the beginning, now seemed to take his arguments more seriously. Even Judge Arnold, though still skeptical, appeared to be more receptive to Andrew's points. Andrew knew that this was just one step in a long journey. The case was far from over, and the corporate lawyers would continue to fight tooth and nail to protect their interests. But for the first time in days, Andrew felt a flicker of hope. They had exposed the forgeries, and the court had recognized the truth. That was a victory in itself. As the court adjourned for lunch, Andrew stepped outside to clear his mind. The air was crisp, and he tried to take a moment to breathe. But as he walked toward the courthouse steps, his phone buzzed again. The number was blocked, but this time, Andrew wasn't going to be intimidated. He answered the call. "Mr. Carter," the voice on the other end was cold and threatening. "You think you've won? You're just getting started. If you think you can take down the corporation, you're mistaken. You have no idea what you're up against." The line went dead before Andrew could respond, but he was no longer afraid. The threats had become predictable, but they wouldn't stop him. He had come too far. The case was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to see it through to the end. The days following the courtroom breakthrough were a blur of activity. Andrew spent hours poring over the evidence, double-checking every detail, ensuring that every argument was airtight. The case had entered its final phase, and the corporate legal team had been relentlessly fighting back. Michael Talbot, the lead attorney for the corporation, had been more aggressive than ever, launching one attack after another to discredit Andrew and his arguments. But despite the pressure, Andrew remained resolute. He knew the stakes. This case was no longer just about Linda's bakery or small business protections. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had been decades in the making. Elaine had been helping him gather additional evidence, tirelessly working behind the scenes to ensure their case was ironclad. She had connected him with journalists who were willing to cover the story, opening the door to broader public exposure. Every day felt like a race against time. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching, waiting for him to slip up. Every knock on his door, every unknown number calling, left him on edge. But he couldn't afford to let fear control him. Not when so many people were depending on him. It was the night before the final arguments that Andrew received the call he had been dreading. His phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, and when he answered, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Mr. Carter." The voice was low, menacing. "You've pushed us too far. You think you're going to win this case? Think again. If you don't drop it now, we'll make sure you regret it." Andrew's heart pounded, but he knew that backing down wasn't an option. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly. "This is bigger than just me or my case. I'm doing what's right." There was a brief silence on the line, and then the voice spoke again, colder this time. "We'll see how long your bravery lasts. The people you're up against, they have no boundaries." The call ended abruptly, leaving Andrew with a sick feeling in his stomach. But instead of fear, what settled over him was a sense of determination. This wasn't just about fighting for Linda anymore. It was about taking down a system of corruption. He was going to finish this, one way or another. The next day, Andrew entered the courtroom for the final time, his mind sharper than ever. The tension in the room was palpable, and as he stood before Judge Arnold, he could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of months of hard work, danger, and sacrifice. The room was filled with spectators, reporters, and, of course, the corporate legal team, led by Michael Talbot, who still wore the same smug smile, but Andrew could see the cracks beginning to form. Judge Arnold called the court to order. "Mr. Carter," he said, "you've made your case, but as you know, the defense has submitted a number of objections. It is now time for your final argument." Andrew took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and walked toward the bench. His mind was clear, his conviction stronger than ever. He knew what was at stake. He knew the risks, but he also knew that the truth was on his side. Your Honor, Andrew began, his voice steady but filled with passion, this case is about more than just the law. It's about fairness, justice, and the ability of small business owners to stand up against corporate giants. We've seen how these corporations use their influence to twist the law to their advantage, exploiting people like Linda and countless others. He paused, glancing over at Linda, who sat in the front row, her face filled with anxiety, but also hope. Andrew felt a surge of determination. The law that was meant to protect small businesses is now being used to crush them. And the very system we rely on for justice has been corrupted to protect the powerful. But today, we have the chance to right that wrong. Andrew went on to meticulously lay out his final argument, highlighting the evidence he had presented throughout the trial. The forged documents, the manipulation of the law, and the underlying corruption that had been exposed. He referenced key moments in the case where the defense had failed to substantiate their claims and how the corporation's actions had been motivated purely by greed and the desire to maintain control. As I stand here today, Andrew said, I ask you, Your Honor, to consider not just the legal implications, but the moral ones as well. The people in this courtroom are relying on you to do the right thing, to hold accountable those who seek to manipulate the system. This case is about more than Linda's Bakery. It's about the future of every small business owner who is vulnerable to exploitation. It's about protecting the very foundation of our legal system. As Andrew finished his statement, the room fell into a hushed silence. His words had landed, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that he had given everything he had. The case was no longer about the law itself. It was a battle for integrity and justice. Judge Arnold sat in silence, his gaze fixed on Andrew. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to grow even heavier. The corporate lawyers exchanged uneasy glances, knowing that their chances of winning had significantly diminished. Talbot, once confident, was now clearly rattled. The judge turned to the defense. Mr. Talbot, he said sharply, your objections have been noted, but they have not been substantiated. This court will not tolerate any further attempts to manipulate or deceive. You may present your closing statement, but I warn you, if you cannot present evidence to refute the claims made by Mr. Carter, I will not allow your arguments to continue. Talbot rose slowly, his posture stiff, but the usual smugness was gone from his expression. He glanced at Andrew, who remained standing at the plaintiff's table, unwavering. Talbot took a moment to gather himself before speaking, but his words lacked the usual conviction. Your Honor, we stand by our position that Mr. Carter's case is based on flawed assumptions and misinterpretations of the law, he said, his voice faltering. But we acknowledge that this case has raised important questions that need further examination. The judge nodded, his expression unreadable. We will adjourn for a brief recess while I review the final evidence. I will render my decision shortly. As the court recessed, Andrew took a deep breath. He couldn't relax, not yet. But he felt a small sense of relief. He had given it everything he had. Now, all he could do was wait. When the court reconvened, the judge's decision was swift and direct. After reviewing the evidence presented by both sides, Judge Arnold said, "It is clear that the defendants' actions have been motivated by a desire to manipulate the law for their own benefit. The forged documents, the misrepresentation of the law's intent, and the manipulation of the system are unacceptable." The room was still, the weight of the judge's words hanging in the air. "I rule in favor of the plaintiff," Judge Arnold declared. "The corporation will pay damages, and the law will remain as intended, to protect small business owners from exploitation." A cheer erupted from the plaintiff's side, and Linda, who had been anxiously waiting for the decision, finally let out a relieved sob. She rushed forward to hug Andrew, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "We did it, Linda. This is just the beginning." As Andrew left the courtroom, the weight of the battle still pressed on his shoulders. The case was over, but the fight for justice wasn't. The corporation wouldn't stop trying to protect their interests, but now Andrew had the law on his side. He had exposed their lies, and he had proven that the truth could prevail. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with threats, challenges, and moments of doubt. But in the end, Andrew knew that standing up for what was right had made all the difference. The battle may have been won, but the war for justice would continue, and Andrew Carter was ready to keep fighting.